This was not the dilemma of conscience for him. This was not the dilemma of cruelty, of ruthlessness for him. He thought that the death penalty had to be used for revolutionary purposes, period.
For a ruthless revolutionary, Guevara came from a surprisingly comfortable background. He'd been born Ernesto Guevara, the son of well-to-do parents in Rosario, Argentina. A sickly child, he suffered from asthma from an early age. The name Che, a slang term for an Argentine, was given to him years later by his Cuban guerrilla comrades. As a teenager, he'd begun to develop some unorthodox views. A friend remembers a dispute over religion.
He expressed the opinion that Jesus as a revolutionary leader had been a total flop, which was a great shock to all of us. And we said, "Yo, you can't possibly mean that about Jesus." And he said, "Oh yes, I can. And I'll tell you, if I ever run into Jesus Christ as a revolutionary leader, I would step on him like a squishy worm." And he went like that with his foot. And we were all absolutely horrified. It was said with such anger and rage and hatred at the time that I never forgot it. And then later, when the execution of all those people in Cuba after the revolution, the mass executions that he planned and executed and he took care of, I remember it. I remember that.
At the age of 26, Guevara left his home in Argentina and set off on a tour of Latin America. It was now that his view of the world began to take shape.
He was only semi-political at the time he first undertook that long trip. He was learning an awful lot every mile he went about the conditions of this vast and also very various continent. And he was seeing problems of landlordism, of corrupt military dictators wherever he went.
Eventually, in 1954, Guevara arrived in Guatemala, in the midst of an American-backed overthrow of a democratic government.
He saw how, in his eyes, a reformist government that was doing what should have been done for the people fell as a result of a CIA-organized offensive. This, in a sense, is his first political awakening.
Now, at the beginning of the 60s, Guevara had found a cause. Along with Fidel Castro, he had made a revolution in America's backyard. And they both knew that the US was not going to take it lying down.
We are part of America, and yet we are different. They will threaten us, they will aim their guns at us. We will not retreat. There will be more and more of us. The whole progressive world is with us. We will defend ourselves, and we will win.
The United States utterly detested this Cuban government, and really it became a complete obsession. It was precisely because the Cubans were so close, not just geographically, but like sort of cousins and American cousins, and that they had turned against the American way of life as it would be seen from Washington.
This little island produces more sugar than any other country in the world.
The US's first response to the uprising was to impose an economic blockade on Cuba.
Cuba was, in every respect, a department of the North American economy. Its main product, sugar, was sold entirely to the Americans. The whole of Cuban trade depended on the United States. To cut it off was to cut off the jugular.
But trade sanctions were just the beginning. Within months, Cuba was under attack. The Bay of Pigs invasion force was manned by anti-Castro Cubans from Florida. It was heavily backed by the CIA.
Cuban revolutionary troops such as these have invaded Castro's leftist island fortress. Fidel's grip is threatened as word of some defections comes out. But the fiery bearded Castro is hardly short on words as he attacks what he calls United States imperialism.
Castro mobilized his forces against the insurgents. Within days, the invasion force was defeated. Guevara rejoiced in the American defeat. For him, it was a blow against the evil empire.
que Playa Girón es un símbolo para todos los pueblos oprimidos. Playa Girón es la primera derrota del imperialismo en América Latina, pero también es una de las primeras derrotas del imperialismo en escala mundial.
Just 3 months after the Bay of Pigs, Guevara was finally to come face to face with the enemy. It was August 1961. Guevara, by now a government minister, arrived in Punta del Este, Uruguay, for a conference of economics ministers.
Che was, of course, a great hit outside the conference on the streets of Punta del Este with all the lovely Uruguayan and Argentine ladies following him around as he strode romantically through the streets in his fatigues. So they liked him. He was a star in this meeting of great finance ministers.
In public, Guevara did little to hide his hostility towards the American delegation. And in a speech to the conference, he predicted the imminent collapse of American capitalism.
He got up and said that the revolutionary impulse was spreading across the continent and that there was nothing the United States could do now to forestall the eventual communization of the hemisphere.
Richard Goodwin was an aide in the new Kennedy administration. He got his first close-up look at the notorious revolutionary at a reception that evening.
He saw me smoking a cigar, and he told an Argentine who he knew and who I knew, came over to me and said that Che said he saw you smoking a cigar, but he guessed you wouldn't dare smoke a Cuban cigar. And I said, you tell him I'd love to smoke a Cuban cigar, but we can't buy them in the United States. And so the next day in my hotel room, there was this box here, which was full of cigars, with a little note in Spanish which said, since I have no greeting card, I have to write. Since to write to an enemy is difficult, I limit myself to extending my hand.
Through the Argentine intermediary, Guevara arranged to meet the young American in private.
Well, I remember when we walked in the room, there was a chair facing a couch, and that's all, furniture virtually. So Che walks over, you see there are 4 of us and only a place for 2 people to sit, so he sat down on the floor. So I wasn't going to let him out-proletarianize me, so I sat down on the floor. And the very first thing he said to me, he said, you know, I'd like to thank you for the Bay of Pigs. He said, our support was uncertain, our hold on the country was shaky. You solidified the country behind us. You made it possible for us to get rid of our middle-class opposition. It says that it was one of the great breakthrough for our revolution. So since he was obviously right, I just said, you're welcome.
At the end of a 4-hour meeting, Goodwin sat down and wrote a memo to the president. He explained that Guevara had come to make the Americans an offer.
The conversation with Guevara indicates that Cuba is undergoing severe economic stress, and that Cuba desires an understanding with the U.S.
Guevara admitted that the economic embargo had brought the Cuban economy to its knees. They were desperate. In return for a lifting of the blockade, Cuba would end its one-party system and introduce free elections.
They were genuinely concerned to try and end the blockade and to try and end also the military threats. They would have liked to strike a deal. They would have been prepared to compromise so long as they could preserve Cuban sovereignty and preserve the major social gains of the revolutionary process.
I was up all night, and a helicopter brought us into the White House lawn where Kennedy was waiting, and I walked with Kennedy up to his office. I said, look, Che gave me this box of cigars, and he opened it himself. He opened it, and he said, are they good? And I said, hell, they're the best. So Kennedy, he immediately grabbed one and bit off the end and lit it. And he took about 2 or 3 puffs, and then turned around to me and said, hell, you should have smoked the first one. So I said, too late now, Mr. President.
But despite their shared taste for Havana cigars, Kennedy wasn't interested in any deal.